Hey, welcome back. This is actually your very last lesson of this semester, so get excited. I heard you cheering. That's okay. There was one more on the syllabus after that, but I ended up kind of pilfering different parts of it to include in other things as they made sense throughout the semester, and now there's nothing left for that one. Sorry. But what I thought we'd do, over the course of the semester, really what we've done is looked at like a very individual level type of communication, like how do you give a training demo, how do you give a persuasive talk. And that's good things because that's the thing that's going to be most useful to you. At the end here, just as sort of a FYI, I thought I would just sort of blow it up to a macro level. And when you think about all the tens of millions of interactions that people have where they communicate, like how does that then create organizations and governments and societies and et cetera, et cetera. So that's what we're going to talk about today. This is the point at which I would ask you to think about how communication from organizations affect your life. And you would write down things like, man, I learned a lot from like Twitter, or perhaps like, gosh, I didn't realize I see so many ads, and that affects like me, and I just think about buying stuff all the time because like it's constantly there, and I'm being made aware of what I don't have, like those kinds of things. That's what you would come up with. Good job. So our objectives for today. God, these are long. So we're going to talk about two things called function and structure in organization, like two different types of communication issues in an organization. We're going to talk about a couple different types of organizations. We're going to talk about four different types of communication that is important to organizations. And then we're going to clarify the role of power in organizations and in society. So here's a quote that I find that if you really take a moment to think about it, will probably blow your mind, okay? Most people think about organizations as needing good communication, right? Like we need like good messaging from Coca-Cola to make us want to buy Coke. What we don't think about is that organizations like are communication. And this, like, you're probably just rolling your eyes at me right now, but consider this, okay? This is the quote from Organizing Modernity, one of my favorite books because I'm a weirdo. But it says, organizations are actor networks going through a period of relative stability, right? And so what we mean by that is that every organization that we just sort of take for granted as existing as an organization, whether it's a government, whether it's Coca-Cola, whether it's Mizzou, always started out as people talking to one another, right? And that seems really dumb, but consider this, right? So take Mizzou, for example. It's a college, it's a university, it's a land grant institution, it's part of higher education. That is a relatively new thing in the grand history of like humans, right? And it started, in a number of places, but it started with people coming together at some point and saying, particularly in America, and saying this system of like journeyman and apprentice learning is some crap, and we need to organize this better. And so they started talking and communicating and all that good stuff. And eventually, through that communication, organized themselves into like the first colleges and universities and whatnot, and sort of organize that system that now we then take for granted, right? It was originally kind of what we would call a movement, if you want to call, higher education a social movement. And then it sort of ossified and codified and institutionalized into these things that we take for granted as just existing in nature, like like Mizzou. And so another example might be like a social movement that starts out as some people protesting and then organizes, and then eventually they have like a leader and then a national office, and then maybe they become a nonprofit or a lobbyist firm, and then all of a sudden they're a thing, right? But it started out with people coming together to talk to one another and express different messages through different mediums, and come together and make a thing. So anyway, so what I'm saying here is that organizations don't need communication, they are communication. Isn't that weird? Okay, so when we think about what communication making an organization, it's like it organizes purposeful groups, right? The communication is what takes away some of the ambiguity. It says these are our goals, this is what we're shooting for here, and then people sort of orient themselves based around that. Two of the ways that people do this are what we call function and structure, okay? This is the two things that we can break down when we think about how communication makes an organization. And so function is basically, you could think about function as the message, right? So it's the thing that we're saying. And it comes in a couple different, forms. And so the first one being production, which is very silly, right? So it's like very simple. So it coordinates an activity toward accomplishing a task, right? So this could be, how to have a movement where you go out and you picket stuff. It could be, some bylaws saying this is how our new school is going to work. A really simple example would just be standardized processes for closing a store at night, right? Like first you mop the floor and then you count up the cash box and then you unlock the door and et cetera, et cetera. So just kind of like a very, this is what we do kind of thing. The second one is what we call maintenance, and it preserves the stability of existing systems, right? And what that means is, like, typically we have something when we're in an organization and we're working toward a goal, we have some things that we like to see from people. And what we do is some of the communication that we send is meant to reinforce the good things that we like to see from people. And so you think about an employee or a student of the month plaque. All that's really doing, I mean, of course, it's like recognizing a person, and that's generally the way that we think about it, from our sort of personal individual end is like, oh, I got a nice plaque. But really what's happening, right, is the school or the company is saying, like, this is the kind of behavior we want to see. Let's, put these people out in front, give them an award, really make a big deal about it in hopes that it'll reinforce that this is the type of thing that we like to see in the company. And maybe people will say, this person's a role model and I want to be like this person. Okay. Sometimes it doesn't work like that, but that's what they're shooting for, right? So, the purpose of employee of the month programs is to say, this is what we want you all to do. All right. And then the last one is what we call innovation. And basically it's any communication that works to facilitate system change and like move the organization along. I mean, there's people that study just this for their whole life. But we think about it in terms of like any communication that centers on how do we get better? So maybe it's policy revision, maybe it's forums to talk about what the future is going to hold, maybe it's focus groups. That's the type of communication where we say, all right, based on, it's different from maintenance, right? Rather than preserving the status quo, we say, what do we want to change? All right, so the next part, that was the message. The next part is the medium, right? So how do those messages flow, and how do they get distributed throughout the organization? So the first thing to consider is direction. So does most of the stuff come from the top? That would indicate a very hierarchical top-down organization, right? Like we wait for the CEO to tell us what to do because he knows what's up. But it could be also more horizontal, right? It could be a little more egalitarian. You could have, a number of teams that sort of work independently of one another and sometimes come together to talk. And that would be a different type of direction. Okay. The other one, so that's sort of like direction, like which way does it flow? So up or down or side to side. The second one then is, what are the patterns of that, right? Like what sort of, if you think about the, Mississippi River is generally flowing from north to south, the patterns is all right, well, it weaves east and west, through this place, down through the other, and we can track that. And the communication is kind of the same way, right? So think about your friend group, if there's one person that's always sort of in the know and sharing stuff, who do they share it with first? Do they usually share it with their bestie, but then that bestie will then tell, her other friend, and then it gets spread, and so there's generally a chain through which stuff flows. And so in an organization, whenever we study that, we look at it and we say, this is important to know about, because, the spread of information can help us track power and authority and where things got screwed up, if the message got messed up, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing is to think about is that for every type of organizational communication, there is both informal and formal, right? So formal would be the CEO sending a policy announcement or a official memo. And then the informal communication would be, your department's reaction to it. And the department head may be the boss said this, but also we're probably going to do this other thing because that's a dumb idea, so those kinds of things. All right. So when we think about types of organizations, where all this could play out, I mean, some of it is governmental stuff, political roles, which is fascinating to me. And I kind of want to skip down to the main one is societal roles. So how does communication in an organization shape society? And that's what we're going to talk about when we come back. We talk about the media, the ever maligned the media. All right.